you read the title, you saw the thumbnail, and you know we're here to renovate the laundry room. This is part 1 of a 2-part series, and if you stick around, I'll show you how to get to this from this. Alright, you can stop booing now. The first step was to get rid of these coax cables. I don't think we're going to use them in the future, but just to be safe, I pushed them back into the attic instead of cutting them. To fill the hole, I used some drywall spackling paste. I really like this product because it starts off pink, but by the time it dries, it turns white, so you know when it's ready. And I was working against gravity here, so I used some tape to support it. Either way, we're going to sand it down later, so it doesn't matter. You probably saw this in the beginning, but we're going to be installing shiplap on the room, so we also got to remove the trim from the bottom. A pocket knife and a pry bar are going to be your best friends throughout this step. I set the baseboards aside, and I made sure that the wall was perfectly flat for the shiplap, not shaplap. In many cases, when you take off the baseboard, you're going to notice that there are some screws at the bottom. These screws are super useful because they mark out the location of the stud. So using the combination of the screws and a stud finder, I mapped out each location because this is where we're going to be nailing the shiplap to. The idea here is that the shiplap is going to be more well supported if it's nailed into a stud than just the bare drywall. After this, the next part was pretty easy. I cut a lot of the shiplap boards to size and I started nailing them into the wall. Well, before you start nailing them, just make sure your first piece is level. No house is perfect, and sometimes the floor is not perfectly level, so just make sure you're making this adjustment. And since you're securing your first piece to the wall, that's the only time you have to check for level. Every other piece will follow. This is probably overkill, but I put 3 nails into each stud location. I suppose you could use a hammer to nail the shiplap, but I'm all about convenience, so I'm using my Brad Rodriguez nail gun to secure the shiplap. In this shot, you see 2 important things. You see a lip at the top of the previous shiplap board. This is what allows you to set the next board on top of it securely. The other thing is that you'll sometimes have interference from things like pipes when you're placing your boards. It's not a big issue, you can just measure about how far it is and then cut it out of the shiplap. A jigsaw would have been much easier to use in this case, but I don't have one, so we had to work around it. This can get a little messy sometimes, but they do sell trim to cover up the round cutout. Sadly, it didn't fit. Just kidding. Measure twice, cut once is how the old saying goes. Otherwise, you'll probably be doing the opposite. It doesn't take very long to get the hang of it, and once you gain momentum, it's a pretty quick process. Once that was done, I got started on the wall that was on the opposite side. You'll notice that some of these cuts are very rough, but it really doesn't matter because they get covered up by a plate anyway. As we approach the top, the likelihood of the board lining up with the ceiling line is close to impossible, so I brought out the table saw and cut the last board to size. And here's another glimpse of what I mean when I say that no house is perfect. The last board was cut to size, and yet there's still a variance in the size of the gap from one side to the other. No worries though, because this can easily be covered up with corner trim. One thing to consider is that you're changing the depth of the wall in relation to the electrical outlet or even the light switch, and you won't be able to put the plastic cover over the switch if it's not flush with the wall. To fix that, you can buy one of these metal plates from your local hardware store, and this will allow the switch to sit flush with the wall again. You will also need to buy longer screws. 2-inch screws worked in my case. Things were looking great, but I was dreading this next part in the renovation. And that's because this next part had to do with mitered corners. You can achieve this by setting the blade to 45 degrees and then cutting the shiplap. I put all of my effort into perfecting the corner because I knew that the opposite end would get covered by the trim pieces. Now that the spackling paste up top was dry, I started sanding. And if you want your shiplap to have a nice finish, put some spackling paste on every nail hole and then sand that down. Also, wear a mask just to avoid breathing in any of that dust. It's 2021 at the time of recording this, so you're probably used to it anyway. After I finished sanding, I put a lot of time into covering up those ugly gaps using the corner molding I was talking about earlier. And while I was at it, I also attached the baseboard. With those trim pieces installed, our corners were looking a lot better than before. I just want to give a quick shout out to this video sponsor, my wallet, because nobody paid me to do this. Alright, now we can get back into mounting the cabinet. And there is an entire video on how I made this cabinet, so be sure to check that out. Gosh, that's some bad internet. Well hey, since your screen's frozen anyway, be sure to like and subscribe if you like what you're seeing. I mentioned that we'd be installing a cabinet now, but we also thought it would be a really cool idea to install a drying rack with it. I bought this metal pipe and 2 corresponding pipe flanges. The pipe flanges allowed us to attach the pipe to the cabinet, and then the opposite end would attach to the wall. I played limbo by myself for a little while, and once I was done doing that, I tried to install the cabinet. So here's something I calculated wrong. The pipe and the cabinet combo were a little too wide for the wall. I went and bought another pipe that would fit, and since they didn't have the exact size I wanted, I had to use some coupling pieces to get the desired final length. And I know you can have these cut to size, but I think the coupling pieces actually look pretty cool. Once I got the cabinet in the spot I wanted, and the metal pipe was touching the opposite wall, I screwed the cabinet into place using a drill, and I did this right at the stud location. I then made sure that the drying rack was level and I screwed that into place too. Alright, so here's the crazy part. I had to take everything down again because I was really only testing the fitment. I got my metal pipes and I cleaned them with acetone because sometimes they do come with oil on them. And since all our metal pieces are different colors, we're just going to spray paint them to give them a more uniform look. We saw this a moment ago, but this is Rust-Oleum's metallic flat soft iron paint. When using this type of product, I try to give the item I'm painting a few different coats. I also like using a clear coat enamel because that's going to help with durability. By the end, this thing had so many coats that a polar bear would be jealous. While that dried up, I taped up the entire room to get ready for paint. We wanted the room to have an off-white creamy finish, so that's what we went with. When painting, it really all comes down to preference. I like painting the edges and any parts that are difficult for the roller to reach first, just because it makes the rest of the process feel a little bit easier. Since this is shiplap, this would be the perfect time to paint between the gap. I do want to point out that the color looks a little bit yellow on here, but that's due to the bad lighting, which we're going to fix in the next video. The color actually looks something like this. Alright, so I painted the room, but if you remember the cabinet, it's actually a very similar color. I wanted there to be a little bit of contrast between the wall and the cabinet, so I bought some alcohol ink, and then mixed that with the cabinet paint that I already had. I actually ran out of alcohol ink, so I might have gone a little bit darker if I had the option. I might go a little darker in the next video, depending on the type of feedback I get. So if you'd be so kind, please let me know if this color is good, or if I should go a little bit darker. I did make a little friend in the process, but something tells me he wasn't having a good time. When that was all said and done, our cabinet looked something like this, and I even had some paint to spare. I decided it would be a good idea to put this away for a little while, just in case the cabinet needed some touch-ups. And while the cabinet dried, I started putting some silicone caulk right over the baseboard, just to give it a nice and clean finish. After that, I started setting up our drying rack. And since I had drilled into this wall earlier in this video, the positioning was super easy since we knew exactly where the screw holes were. I struggled a little bit to get the cabinet back in here, just like I did the first time, but the advantage that I had was that everything was predetermined at this point. After I secured the cabinet in place, I also secured the drying rack, and that meant that part 1 of the laundry room renovation was complete.